Okay, so the first step of the solve strategy is state the question. This means you got to figure out what the question is in the word problem, which is also known as what are we doing? So to figure out what the problem is, you need to simplify it. Simplify means to make it easier for you to understand. Most of these word problems are written in math language by some highfalutin math professor because that's what it's supposed to look like on the Smarter Bounds test. But we need to put it in our own words in Panther or teen language. And to do that, the first step is to identify the commands and the questions of the problem. Questions are much easier to find. That's because they end with a question mark, just as your regular English teacher has taught you. Here's a few examples like, what's the meaning of life? Why do I have to do this? Because we tell you to. When is it lunchtime? Which is things that you guys all think about, right? But notice they each end with the question mark. Now, on the right column, here's some questions that you would most likely see in math. How much money does Hector have? Question mark. How many trees are in the park? Question mark. And what does the graph show? Question mark. Those are the easiest things to find in a word problem, is the questions. What's not as easy to find is this concept called the command, which also comes from your language arts class. And commands are basically orders that you're supposed to do. Usually they start with a verb and they end with a period. A command is when it's an invisible voice telling you to do something. For example, like clean your room, listen to your teacher, good idea, follow directions, period, read the book, period, turn on the TV, period. Not something that we'll usually tell you to do. But those are examples of commands like clean, listen, follow, read, and turn on are verbs and they end with periods. So those are commands that you usually hear from either your parents or your teacher, etc., etc. Now, in math, the commands also start with verbs as well, but these are verbs that are specifically tied into the math domain, such as solve the problem, draw the graph, solve for x, calculate the answer. So as you notice, the verbs here are more math-centered, like solving and drawing and calculating, but they still have the same punctuation mark that ends them, the famous period. So now I'm going to go back to that word problem I was addressing. And I've done the first step already for you. I'm going to take a close look at the question and start underlining the commands and the questions. So question marks are the easier ones, such as how does the pattern grow? That's obvious. Or how many tiles will there be in figure 100? That's right there. Now the commands, not as easy, but they start out with verbs such as examine the pattern at right. That's as if Mrs. Downham is telling you, okay, examine that pattern on the right. Now, notice that on your paper, there's also this other verb, sketch. Sketch figures 4 and 5. That's a verb. Also, explain how you know. That word explain appears a whole lot. And explain how you know here in section B. So as you notice, there's a bunch of little questions and commands hidden within this problem. So my recommendation is you take those commands and questions and pull them on a separate sheet of paper where you can organize it just without all the other gobbledygook. So what's really going on in 1-12 is it's not just one problem. It's actually a whole bunch of little mini problems hidden within, such as examine the tile pattern, sketch figures 4 and 5. How does the tile pattern grow? Explain how you know. How many tiles are there in figure 100? And explain how you know again. So with commands and questions, I would recommend underlining the verbs, such as examine, sketch, and explain. And these verbs actually show up in other subjects, such as science, hint, hint, or social studies. And these are what we call high level vocabulary. So now that you're faced with the vocabulary, this is where you got a few choices. If you don't know what these verbs are, you can go ask a teacher, ask a classmate, or ask Google. Your math teacher prefers you to ask your classmates first because some of your classmates actually do know these concepts from previous classes. But let your teachers be the last resort if your entire team does not seriously know what a word means, like examine or sketch. So now that we've got those, we're going to look at the vocabulary of the question and figure out what we need to know. One of the biggest challenges is learning the math. And now putting in our own words. So examine really means to look. So for examining the tile pattern, it just means, first of all, look at the drawings. Sketch figures in 4 and 5 is really draw figures 4 and 5. And then how does the tile pattern grow? Means you got to write about how many new tiles each figure has over time and explain how you know this using the word because. When you see the word explain, it usually means that you have to use the word because in your explanation. And of course, then there's this question, how many figures are there in tile 5? And explain how you know. This really means write how many figures tile figure 100 would have, and explain how you wrote that number using the word because. So, as you can see, why do we do this strategy? Because it's a lot easier for you to understand a concept if you question if you own it. This is, of course, what the problem had. Examine the tile pattern and sketch figures 4 and 5. And then down here is how we simplified it to look at the drawings and draw figures 4 and 5. Which version would be easier for you to do? Correct, the one on the bottom, because you took the problem and you started to understand it. And so we're going to, for the rest of the series of the Solve Strategy videos, we're going to be focusing on just these 2 problems out of the other 10 you got to work on. So, because it's going to be easier to chunk the problems down into smaller bits and take them 2 steps at a time rather than try to do all 15 at the same time. Okay, so now with that, you're going to go to the next video, which is O for organizing your facts.